pleasure of introducing her. The following session is entitled A Journey Through the Seven Laws of Teaching by John Milton Gregory. Mrs. Kate Deddens has dedicated herself as an educator to her family and to members of her local as well as national home education and micro school communities for over 30 years. Her writing has been published in several venues, including at the, I always say Circe, but Kirte Institute, the Imaginative Conservative, the Federalist, and Classical Conversations. Please welcome Mrs. Deddens.
Wow, way to go, John Milton Gregory, because I know you're here for him and not me. Thank goodness. My hope is to do this work justice. It's a slim volume. It's also available online in free editions. I think there are a couple places you can get a PDF of it. Not very good, but full of very rich content. So I recommend it to your reading. I think it's also not that difficult to read in terms of his language, though he wrote it in the mid-1800s. So thank you all for being here. Welcome to this session. There are some handouts in the back, probably not enough, but it's material that I'm not going to cover, so you can take it if you like. It's mostly just biographical material for the author and some thoughts. I'm going to dive right in with an introduction. There are several things that would normally go into introducing something like this, and I'm kind of going to skip them because we're short on time. So one of the things that John Milton Gregory says is with your students to make haste slowly. So I'm going to try to make haste, but I'm not going to try to trip over myself. I'm trying to go through the material in an in-depth way. I will also be offering this as a free webinar on August 8th with more information, slides, more complete information, but today it has to fit into a certain amount of time, about 45 minutes they tell me. So I want to start by asking one thing that is dear to my heart. Why read this book? Why should Lutherans read this book? It's in the intertwining of classical Christian education and our Lutheran distinctives that we bear the greatest fruits and the desired goals in our students, to raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, in their Lutheran faith, and for the benefits and blessings they will bring to others in their future vocations, so for the two kingdoms. Except we're not going to separate them, we're going to bring them together and synthesize them, as Jean B. said so eloquently the first morning. 3 reasons why I think this is particularly pertinent to Lutheran education. The first is the idea of paideia. Paideia basically means the cycle of education. In the Greek, it's enkuklios paideia. Tracy Lee Simmons, in a wonderful book called Climbing Parnassus, writes, paideia is the Greek word translated to mean enculturation. It was about instilling core values, enunciating standards, and setting moral precepts, and the object was to educate autonomous men and women, citizens and not robots. And we just heard quite a bit about that in the plenary, so what a wonderful introduction to the idea that we want free men, that paideia in the liberal arts produces free men and women. So this is our goal. John Milton Gregory himself defines education as the communication of experience. Really, he means the experience of humanity going all the way back. Lutheran classical educators should aim for students to be enculturated by worship and catechesis in the experience and culture of God, and enculturated in the experience of their vocations. So again, we have the two kingdoms, enculturated in the experience of God, the knowledge of God, God's kingdom, and in experiences that will help them carry out their vocations and be a blessing. The second reason is the idea of catechesis, which in the Greek means instruction by word of mouth. On our website, we write, catechesis is the branch of religious education dealing with the theory and method of teaching Christian doctrine. John Milton Gregory, over and over again in this book, emphasizes the importance of speaking, conversing, verbal inquiry guided by the teacher. So the 7 laws of teaching is highly catechetical. It involves memorization, remembering, understanding, and applying, primarily through speech, which is why I don't have a PowerPoint this morning, because I wanted to just maybe model that a little bit. PowerPoint would make it go much faster, I get that, and the reason I wrote it all up is because I won't have time to do it during the talk, otherwise I would write it as I was talking. But some sacrifices have to be made. You have to read my writing, which hopefully you can. So note also that we can see the stages of the trivium if we think of Dorothy Sayers in this too. We can see trivium, logic or dialectic, the trivium, grammar, logic, and dialectic. We will also see the third reason is that we are made, as our plenary speaker so eloquently put it, imago Dei. We are made in the image of God. Education is for image bearers. C.S. Lewis might have said that education should be for men with chess. The abolition of the man is all about a description of what happens when we educate men without chess. But this is an education for men with chess and women with chests. What does that mean? It means that they have a moral objectivity, a sense of right and wrong, a sense of true and false, and an aesthetic sense of beauty that aligns with that. Gregory points out that all motives of study have a moral character because objects of study involve objective aesthetic and moral judgment, likes and dislikes. No education or teaching can be divorced from virtue. You will either convey it and communicate it, or you will not. So in the goals of this session, I read my description again, I was like, wow, that's a lot. But it's to go in depth, walk in depth through the 7 laws, to look at a particular quote from Wisdom and Eloquence by Littlejohn and Evans, where they write, despite differences in aptitude, each student has an innate capacity to remember, to analyze, and to synthesize information and experiences. The ideal liberal arts education does everything possible to maximize these intellectual abilities, producing students who possess the capacity to learn and to adapt what they have learned to all sorts of situations and challenges. As we move through the 7 laws, which I hope to do kind of quickly with an example following each, so I will try to make pace slowly. Notice how these can be applied at every age. You can start in preschool, you can end with adults, you can start with adults, and then go back to preschool and use these because they are based on really what Milton Gregory calls a natural law of human nature. And we heard about that in the plenary as well, the importance of asking what is human nature, because it's through asking what is human nature that we know what kind of education to provide. And we're going to see how the 2 kingdoms are served simultaneously in synthesis and in harmony when we use this kind of education. So we're going to move through each law. We're going to go down into the nitty-gritty and get a bit practical. They're clearly stated. I'm going to try to do an example, either interactive with you, or in the interest of time, I may just have to run through an example. And at the end, draw some conclusions. But hopefully, these are the conclusions we will draw. So first of all, how many people here are familiar with the 7 laws of teaching? Okay. How many people are familiar with Latin? Okay, all of you who are familiar with Latin, I do have a Latin example on the board. It's one of my examples. You're not allowed to participate then, sorry. Only those of you who are not familiar with it can join in. So there's a little bit of a selective example here. And I myself am no Latin expert. I've taught some Latin, but I'm not a Latin expert. It's just a great example. So let's dive right in. How is education defined? John Milton Gregory would say it's furnishing the child with the heritage, the experience of humankind. It is a paideia from the Greek. He writes, it is painting in the mind of another the picture in one's own, the shaping of thought and understanding to the comprehension of some truth which the teacher knows and wishes to communicate. Secondarily, it's the development of capacities and skills, the maturing of body and mind to be able to grow in knowledge and wisdom and understanding. And the telos, or the aim or ultimate purpose of education, is, according to him, to foster full-grown physical, intellectual, and moral adulthood with such resources as are necessary to make life useful and happy in the Aristotelian sense that we just heard about. I'm glad I don't have to go through that now. And as will enable the individual to go on learning from all activities of life. We'll come back to this quote at the end. So let's dive right in. Paideia is enculturation in experience, and it's the synthesis of love of learning, love of what you're learning, and habits of independent study, and the cultivation of abilities and capacities, physical discipline, mental skills, and moral sense, a moral barometer. The 7 laws are basically divided into 3 categories. The first 2 have to do with the actors or agents who are taking part, the teacher and the student. The teacher and the student. The next 2 have to do with mental factors. That's the law of language and the law of the lesson. Those are the 2 middle ones. I don't have all the 3 of the last up there, but the final 3 are processes. The law of the teaching process, the law of the learning process, and review and application of the law. So he speaks in scientific sort of language. He talks about factors and elements and processes, but he is completely coming from within the paradigm of the kind of education we heard about this morning in the plenary. So we're going to define each law, look at it conceptually, maybe with a quick diagram that I tried to draw, and then we're going to walk through an example. So, the law of the teacher must know that which he or she would teach, must study, review and refresh and master what he or she knows. He writes, teachers, either partially or wholly unprepared, are like messengers without a message. They lack the power and enthusiasm to produce fruit. I want to point out here that knowing can be more than knowing facts. Maybe at younger age, it's knowing the facts. It's knowing Latin declensions. It can be a moral concept, like in Aesop's fable. It can be a dialectical question. It can be a system of integrated things. We'll look a little bit later at the classification of animals as an example, right? The system. It can be a big picture. It can be small, it can be large, it can be in between. But the teacher must know what he or she wants to convey and communicate to the student, the goal. So my goal here today is to convey what I think John Milton Gregory is getting at in the context of Lutheran, distinctly Lutheran Christian education. Hopefully I'll be able to do that. You can tell me later if I did or not. Check in with me. So I've written this up. As I said, normally I would write it up as I go along, but in the interest of time, I just made a quick chart of it. Not really that complicated. The teacher knows, and this is how the teacher goes through steps, processes, to communicate what he or she knows to the learner or the student. You go from first glimpse of the material to remembering, this is the student doing this, to remembering the material, to being able to recall the material, to integrating and associating material, to a full understanding. The only time he would say that you get to a full understanding is when you have done all of that, and you can go back and do any of that. And he doesn't really talk about it in the first section, but once you get there, you can use that as a stepping stone to further learning. So it builds foundationally. So let's talk about an example. Let's pick a fairy tale. I went ahead and picked one, Little Red Riding Hood. What would be the first glimpse that a child might have to Little Red Riding Hood? What's their first glimpse?
Pictures.
A picture book, right? A picture book, or maybe they're told a story in the car on the way to church, or whatever, bedtime story. What would the student be exhibiting when they have faint recognition? When they have this recognition of that story. They haven't heard it many times, but if it comes up, they go, yeah, there was a girl in a red cloak. I don't know, there was a wolf, it was scary. Grandmother had big eyes. It could be a bunch of things, right? What would recall look like for a student? Recall, narration, or recitation, depending on what you're teaching. What would that look like in this instant? Right. The learner will be able to tell the story back. The next step is to integrate. What might that look like? What might the learner do? Could be prompted by a teacher. What could you ask, or the student ask him or herself about the story? Because children do this frequently.
Act it out. Act it out.
They could act it out. Yeah, that might be a more ultimate stage. Yeah, but right at this point they might say, what does this sound like in other stories that I've heard? That's integrating or associating. For example, it's a story about, what would you say is the moral of the story? The point. Stay on the path, okay? There could be more than one, right? The teacher knows which one. I know I sound very confused now because I'm asking you for multiple ones, but look, stay on the path. Don't talk to strangers.
Listen to your brother.
You shouldn't do dangerous things, right? What would be another story like that? A fairy tale, a Aesop's fable, anything.
Hansel and Gretel.
I'm sorry?
Hansel and Gretel.
Hansel and Gretel, yes, very closely related to that. How about something a little different? Exactly, the 3 bears. There are more. We could keep going, right? What about the 3 little pigs, right? And at this point, the student is putting the dots together. The learner is putting the dots together, and there are nuances and differences in the meaning. The 3 little pigs is not identical to Little Red Riding Hood, but it's sort of the same, sort of different. So the student is going to begin thinking, and you as the teacher can help guide them, and we'll talk about that in a little while. So this association or integration deepens experience, and then the student comes to a full understanding. What does that look like? Acting it out? What would be another way that a student could demonstrate?
Writing the sequel.
Writing the sequel. Perfect, yes, writing the sequel. Or writing another story that imitates the story, their own story, right? So this demonstrates this level of full understanding. And then when they've gotten there, it's like, oh, now I can start using what I've just learned from Little Red Riding Hood and 3 Little Pigs, and I can start applying that to the next thing that I learn. I'm going to go through the same process, but that's the next thing that I learn. Okay, I've got to hurry up. The second is the law of the learner. The student must attend with interest to the material to be learned. Note that this is not being entertained. The chart over here takes the interest from passive to active to secondary passive active. It's not entertainment. It goes from basic attention that the student might have, which is instinctive, like, oh, I'm sort of going to pay attention, to active, where the student is putting some effort into it, to secondary passive active, which means they're passively engaged and interested, and it's use my word, is attractive to them. They like it, they're engaged with it, but they want to work some more on it. They want to become more engaged. They want to be absorbed. They want to concentrate. This might look like it's the learner's job, but it's actually the teacher who guides from passive to active to secondary passive active. How do you do that? Well, Passive attention is gained by reducing distractions and getting attention, right? That's obvious. But using personal context, putting it in context of the lives of children, what do they already know? What matters to them? Using interesting analogies and illustrations and examples, and modeling enthusiasm, right? Enthusiasm does matter because students will see that you like the topic. Active attention is gained by two things. Can anyone guess? I'm just going to go interactive with it. What would be one thing that would spur active attention?
Asking a question.
Asking a question. Yeah. And we did it just now. What would be the second thing? Associating or integrating, right? This is going to capture their active attention. They're going to work hard for it, probably, but it's going to capture them. The secondary passive attention is when the student reproduces, rearticulates, or recreates, right? So it's down here in this stage where the student is getting here. And once you get a student there, you might never lose them, right? Most students, he says, never get past this stage. You get them here, and they're invested. They're invested in what they're learning. It's meaningful. So the teacher cultivates this process. Let's look at a quick example. The law of the learner, and we'll look at classification of animals. And I'm just going to walk through this because we're going to run out of time. But that's obvious. You would start teaching the lesson about classification of animals. You know, the kingdoms, genus, species, all that jazz, right? You get their attention, you reduce distractions, and then you make the topic personally relevant. What sort of things do they organize at home? Do they organize their Legos? Do they have kitchens where things are organized by, here are the dishes and here are the pots and pans, right? Again, this is for a younger level, but you can take this to more sophisticated levels easily. Build attention and active engagement by asking questions, associating and integrating, like what are different kinds of living things? What do you notice about them? What do you see when you compare them or contrast them? Introduce the concepts of, well, do you know what a kingdom is? What's a kingdom? Have you read stories about kingdoms? What does that mean in this sense? Explore with them. And relate them to their own experience. Like, relate what you're doing to their experiences. And then cultivate secondary passive attention with concentration and independent learning, strenuous mental effort. So at this point, we can ask a student who is at full understanding, at secondary active passive attention, to do what? Go do some reading. Go explore for yourself. Go work on maybe a formal presentation, maybe write a paper, right? These look like they're different, but they kind of all mirror each other in different ways. He compares them to 7 peaks on a mountain range, right? You look down on the same landscape, but you're looking at the landscape from a different mountaintop in each of the ones. The law of the language is a little simpler. The law of the language says that the language the teacher and the learner use have to be in common. It has to be in common. You have to be speaking the same words, right? He writes, the measure of the communicating power of language is not the clarity of what the speaker presents from his or her mind, but what the hearer understands in his or her mind. So words have meaning. They incarnate ideas. What happens in a conversation? This is my example, by the way. What happens in a conversation when you define 2 words differently? Like I can say, my child can come to me and say, I want to go to Dairy Queen and get ice cream. And I can say, we'll do that soon. Right? My definition of soon probably differs from my child's, because my child would probably think, that's now. And I'm thinking, that's in half an hour, maybe later this afternoon, next week. Right. So, and what happens if people don't use the same words when they're in an argument? Or in a debate? Or in a religious denomination? Right? We have to have the same language. If we don't have the language to understand Shakespeare, we can't read it and understand it. If we don't have the language to read the Constitution, we will not be able to understand it. So it has very important implications. There's a great example of this in history of really the invention of a new language, because everything's a language. Math is a language, music is a language. We do everything, human beings, with the logos. Okay? So think of an example in history where language maybe was a revolutionary thing. You might not be able to think of it because I haven't given you very much background. But yeah.
So I was taught in college about a dialect of English called E prime, which gets rid of the to be verb.
Interesting.
Yeah, so like a water molecule looks like Mickey Mouse, but only under certain circumstances.
Uh-huh.
So you have to be very precise with under these circumstances it appears as, not it is.
Right, right. So important. I'm thinking of one that will be really obvious to you the minute I say it, and that is Helen Keller. Okay? Deaf, mute, and blind. Could not behave in a humane manner, could not learn, could not receive instruction or discipline in any fruitful way. What did her teacher, Annie Sullivan, have to do? She had to give her language. She had to create a language that Helen could understand. And what happened to Helen Keller once she did that? It was like a trajectory, right, off the planet. Achievement and understanding and a blessing, the rest of it. Right? So, we're going to move on to the law of the lesson. The truth to be taught must be learned through truth already known. So the law of the lesson, you start with what you know, and you end up discovering what you did not know. What branch of academics is like that? Mathematicians in here. I heard it. Algebra, exactly. This is algebra, okay? Algebra actually comes from an Arabic word, or two words, al-jab, which means transposition or reunion. And in medieval times, barbers were also those that mended your bones and pulled your teeth. It's kind of a scary idea. But they were. And when you tell kids this, they love it. When you tell them this is what algebra is, pulling teeth and cutting hair and mending bones. But it means to break apart, to analyze, pull it apart. It may start that way. Compare, contrast, integrate, and organize. Get things all on the right side of the equation if you know them. Leave the unknown on the other side of the equation. Synthesize, problem solve, and abracadabra. It's magic. You have an answer, right? That is this process of the lesson, to go from the known to the unknown. So let's take a look at an example. This is not going to be a complete example because I don't intend, this reaches, I don't intend to explicitly and literally or poetically translate this Latin segment. This is from Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. I believe it's the very first sentence. So those of you who know Latin, and if I wrote it wrong, don't tell anybody. Those of you who know Latin, don't participate. This is for illustration purposes. But basically, it reads, Gallia est omnis divisa in partes, quorum unam incolunt Belgae, aliam incolunt Aquitani, tertiam incolunt Galli. Those of you who don't know Latin, I bet you can look at this and get a pretty good, actually, idea of what it's talking about. So how are we going to do that? Do you notice any derivatives? Okay, so what derivatives do we notice here? Divisa? What do you think that might mean? Divide. Or could, we don't know what tense yet because we don't know Latin, but divide. What is another one? Partes, parts. Here's three more on the first line. Is, now if you know a little bit of French or something, two, in. How about omnis? All. All right, so what do you think that first line might mean? Do you notice any capitalization? Okay, never mind that they didn't use capitalization or punctuation, but we can. That would probably be capitalized anyway, but we have some capitalization. What does that tell us? Place or names or a people name. How about quorum? Quarter? about tertium? 3. Okay, and Gallia sound like what, if we know any history? Gaul. So already you've pretty much got a gist. You could also notice and look at it this way and say, what does a proper sentence have in it? Subjects, verbs, and what else? Objects, yes. All right, so we have something that repeats itself 3 times, and we've kind of seen a bunch of nouns. We might guess those are verbs. We might not know what it means, but does anybody want to venture a vague guess, a gist? I'm not asking for direct translation, but what is he talking about, Julius Caesar, writing to us from 2,000 years ago or so? What do you think he might be talking about? Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
It's divided into 3 parts.
Yeah.
One of them is Belgium, one of them is Aquitaine, and one of them is Gaul.
Yeah, basically. This is not a perfect literal translation, but you can do this with what you already know. Does that mean you just go with what you know and assume that that's got to be perfect because you did it and it must be right? No, what are you going to do next? You're going to check it, you're going to learn more so you can answer those questions. So it's just for an example's sake there. So that's going from the known to the unknown. We organized, we integrated with ideas that we already had, we broke things apart, we talked about capitalization, we talked about the structure of a sentence. We then synthesized, and we came out with a fairly rough translation. It's all Gaul is divided into 3 parts, one of which the Belgae inhabit, the Aquitani inhabit another, and the Gauls inhabit the third. I do this a lot with parents who think Latin is scary. Because their students will come home and say, Latin is scary. And it's like, not yet. But you don't have to tell them that to begin with. All right, so the law of the teaching process. This is to excite and direct the self-activities of the pupil, and as a rule, tell him or her nothing he or she can do by himself or herself. Okay? I'm going to take a little segue here and jump to the plenary talk again, because John Milton Gregory discusses how knowledge is divided into 2 parts. There's the desire to use knowledge as a tool for power, a tool for control, a tool for manipulating our environments. This is a means of livelihood. You can use knowledge this way as a means of livelihood, as a means to gain social standing, as a means to gain wealth and income, to gain a special skill you want to learn just because you're interested in doing it, like golfing, maybe. Winning rewards and avoiding punishments. This is a big one for our students, right? Rewards and punishments. But this flows out, but it is not the primary goal. The primary goal is the love of knowledge for its own sake. And we heard lots this morning that I really cannot improve on. So that was beautifully done. But essentially, at a K through 12 level, this would involve satisfaction of curiosity, solutions to the questions students have, rejoicing in truth, in beauty, and in moral sweetness. And it involves liberty, from Joseph Pieper, right? Leisure and liberty. It can also involve wit and humor, and ultimately, wonder. As Socrates once said, the wise man is the man who knows what he does not know. That's rooted in wonder. We tend to be afraid of it and want to run away. We don't know it, I'm scared, I don't want to learn it. But there's wonder there, and where can the wonder take you? We are drawn to contemplation of reality by a sense of wonder. This is what Augustine tells us. So we do this through the process of questioning. I'm going to kind of hurry through this, but again, I can talk to you later, or we'll have a free webinar where I'll have some slides that are more diagrammed out. But you go through by asking questions. You go through this process. You excite enthusiasm. You guide the direction of the student. You nurture favorable conditions. You do make it, you don't try to make it miserable, right? Interesting, comfortable, no distractions. You encourage students' independence, and you foster a love of learning. Try to have students think a step ahead of you. In other words, you're asking, this is very Socratic, you're asking the questions, but you want them to sort of think of them on their own too, and come up with the answers themselves. This allows them to own what they're learning. They're not taking it from you, they got it, right? Aristotle's rhetoric talks about different levels of logic, and one of the forms of a logical syllogism is called an enthymeme, where you leave out one of the propositions. Often it's the conclusion. So if I say, all men are mortal, the famous one, Socrates is a man, Socrates is moral. If I let you arrive at that question, you own the answer. I didn't just hand it to you and say, this is the fill in the blank. These are basically the 5 common topics. I don't have time to go through all of that right now, but basically the classical 5 common topics of definition, circumstance, relationship, comparison, and testimony. Those are the questions that you can use with your students, and you can look it up. It's plenty available online, and I just don't have time to go into it, although it's one of my favorites, I guess. So, teacher excites, directs with questions, creates favorable conditions, independent learning, and fosters a love of learning. I'm going to look really quickly at an example. I'm going to pick the Nicene Creed. All right? So I'm catechizing my students, or helping to catechize my students in the classroom. I'm not the pastor catechizing. And we're learning the Nicene Creed. How can I ask questions that allow them to explore the creed and become invested in learning more about it and all the things we've been talking about? Well, I can say, what is its nature? Well, it's a creed from the Latin credo, which means I believe, and it's a formal statement of belief, a statement of faith. I can ask, what is it? What is the cause? Why was it needed? So, why was it needed? Why did we need the Nicene Creed? It was in response to heresy. Whose heresy? Arius, right? About the fullness of Jesus' humanity and divinity, right? So how did they do it? How did they do it in history? Well, they gathered together 2 ecumenical councils, one in Nicaea, actually one in Alexandria, around the 4th century AD. You can go into this more thoroughly, right? By whom? Was convened by Emperor Constantine I. They invited about 1,800 bishops, and about 30 actually attended, including some really interesting people. Eusebius, the church historian, who's very famous. Athanasius of Alexandria, who wrote on the Incarnation, which is wonderful book to read. And there's a fable that St. Nicholas actually attended this too. Does anybody know what the story is? What's the story? They punched the heretic. I don't know if that really happened. But this is interesting, right? Right? And if you're also studying history, Eusebius is interesting. You're starting to integrate the subjects, right? You're starting to go into history. You're starting to go into theology. You can talk about on the Incarnation. All of this fosters interest, independent learning, and love of learning. The 6th law is the law of the learning process. This is really important. The pupil must reproduce in his or her own mind the lesson you are trying to communicate. The student must become an investigator with the aim of becoming an independent searcher. The work of education, as he says, contrary to common understanding, is much more the work of the pupil than the teacher. My favorite quote is from Plutarch in On Moralia, when he talks about education is not the filling of a bucket, but the lighting of a fire. Right? This lights a fire of learning. You're not just putting information into the student, but you are lighting a fire for them to continue lifelong learning. A book that I really enjoy, written by a man named Polia, is called How to Solve It. He wrote it in 1945, and I'm going to quote from that because I think it's a great quote. He says, "A great discovery solves a great problem, but there is a grain of discovery in the solution of any problem. Your problem may be modest, but if it challenges your curiosity and brings it into play your inventive faculties, and if you solve it by your own means, you may experience the tension and enjoy the triumph of discovery." Learning is about enduring tension and frustration and not understanding and working through it. And then when you get through it, there's satisfaction and enjoyment and pleasure. He says such experiences at a susceptible age create a taste for mental work and leave an imprint on the mind and character of the student for a lifetime. It's addictive. Once they get used to this, they want more. They want more. So the student is an independent investigator, a questioner, a researcher, and ultimately all of that results in, aha, I solved that algebra problem. I translated that text. I got this idea. These are epiphanies. These lead to enjoyment, happiness, as Aristotle called it, revelation of truth, and a sense of wonder, which makes you want to keep on exploring. I see what I do not know. I'm not intimidated by what I do not know. I want to know it. I want to go find it. So this is the last step, the phases of the learning process, the law of the learner. And there's a lot here to go over, and I don't have that much time left, but basically the process starts. You can help me, actually, because I'm kind of trying to model Gregory a little bit. What's the first step? Back here somewhere? What was that? Teacher needs to know, well, what is the first step the student needs? Because we're talking about the law of the learning process. My fault for not being clear. The first thing is to glimpse, remember, and then commit to memory. Commit to memory. Then be able to recite or recreate it. Narrate it, write it, recite it. Then there's understanding of it. Now notice, that's a grammar stuff, if you're a Sayers fan, right? Memory, recitation. Then we come into some dialectic. Then to understand it. Then to connect and integrate with it. What does Lord Riding Hood have to do with the three little pigs? Then translate into their own words. Be able to put it in their own terms. Or incarnate in their own way. Incarnate the lesson. Seek evidence and proofs to be able to justify any conclusions and then to apply and take action. So this is very catechetical. Notice the questions. Not learning by rote or recall, but when it comes to understanding, we ask, well, what does the lesson say? When it comes to connecting and integrating, what does the lesson mean? When it comes to translating, how can I express this lesson in my own way? When it comes to seeking evidence, do I believe what the lesson tells me? Why do I believe it? And then to apply it. What is the good of it? What good does it show me for my soul, or that I can use for my neighbor? So this is probably a more complicated example because I'm going to jump to the idea of building on knowledge. When you get this full understanding, right, this becomes a foundation or a platform for the next level, and you get more complex and advanced as you grow, as you learn more, and then you build kind of like a building of knowledge. I'm going to try to show you, through starting with a simple mathematical principle, how you might end up with a spiritual lesson or a biblical lesson. So I'm going to begin with a Euclidean common notion 1. Things that are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. So if I have any room, that's like saying if A equals B and B equals C, then what? Then A equals C. That was sort of an empty. Right? That's at a very simple level. Children learn this early, right? They apply this to geometric figures and all kinds of things. What would be a more advanced level for this that you would want to lead your students to or have them come to an understanding of? Comes out of propositional logic, and it's called a hypothetical syllogism. I believe Dr. Boyle used it in the plenary yesterday. So we've gone from basic geometry or math to a logical syllogism, which says if P has a relationship with Q, there's a relationship between them, and Q has a relationship with R, these are variables, you can stick in whatever you want, then what? then P has a relationship with R. Absolutely. This is such a powerful thing to understand and to grasp in full understanding, because then you can begin to apply this to many different things. How do we apply this in concrete ways? We apply it in algebra when we cancel. I can write this differently. I can write this as P over Q Q over R. Now what can I do with it? Cross multiply. I can also, in an equation that's on one side, cancel. Because of this. I can teach them this in kindergarten. I can teach them this in 5th or 6th grade, or earlier if they're ready. Because it's not actually that hard, it's just a matter of seeing it that way. Now how can I take this to a scriptural principle? Bear with me. I hope I don't step on any toes because I didn't get this vetted theologically, but I'm going to be bold and step out in faith and say it. We're told in Ephesians 2 that if we have grace, and we have what? Forgiven grace, for by grace we are saved, we have faith. We're told in James, this is a controversial one, what? If we have faith, we have works. If we have grace, we have faith. If we have faith, we have works. And therefore, logically, if we have grace, we have work. Which we're told in Scripture, again, from Ephesians, but also in other ways, that we are His workmanship created for the good things that He has planned for us to do. Right? So suddenly the tension between Ephesians and James goes, poof. Not there anymore. So, the law, review, and application, and I am going to run out of time, so I hope you all can bear with me. That is the law of review and application. The completion, test, and confirmation of the work of teaching must be made by review and application. A review is more than repetition. A repetition of the mind is the rethinking of a thought, the communication of experience, the rethinking of a thought. It involves fresh conceptions, new associations, and brings increase in facility and capacity. No time in teaching is spent more profitably than in reviewing, either led by the teacher or voluntarily done by the student. So the primary aim of this, it is assessment, because we can have them produce their full understanding, and we can say to them, well, you understood this correctly, but you didn't quite understand that. Let's fix it. Let's go back and fix it. But the main purpose of this assessment is to perfect and correct the knowledge for the student, so they do learn the correct thing. It is to confirm knowledge, in other words, set it, like you're going to set bread, and to render knowledge applicable. Avoid lifeless questions, like multiple choice questions and fill in the blanks. What kinds of questions do we want to aim for at a higher level? Time doesn't allow me to make this too interactive, but one example would be something at the higher levels like a blue book, right? Not a multiple choice test or a quiz, not even exactly an essay quiz, but kind of like that. For example, with Little Red Riding Hood, you might ask, explain how Little Red Riding Hood shows lack of wisdom and compare her in this regard to another character. But show your evidence. You have to tell me why they're comparable. You could switch that up and say why they're different too, but. Or with the scientific method, how does Carl Linnaeus' formulation of the classification of animals help us understand the creation, and by understanding the creation, understand the creator, right? We might ask about the Latin. How is Latin translation similar to both science, like logic, or maybe even math, and poetry? Because we can come up with a literal translation, but if we want to make it good English, we're going to have to translate it into our own language and make it poetic in a way. That's a poetic, artistic, creative step, not a scientific one. If we're looking at the Christian creeds, we might say something simply like identifying several major reasons and using the example of the Nicene Creed to support your claim for why the creeds were important. For example, setting a precedent for a creedal doctrine. So, I'm going to conclude by saying that we have something here that gives us action in accordance with truth, goodness, and beauty. These processes allow our students to glimpse truth, to appreciate beauty, and to take away from it moral assessments and moral values. He writes, if we would have any great truth sustain and control us, we must return to it so often that it will at last rise up in the mind as a dictate of conscience and pour its steady light upon every act or purpose with which it is concerned. This is akin to what we were discussing, or what we were being taught this morning about contemplation. John Milton Gregory calls it a kind of mental incubation. I like to think of it as a dwelling with. I dwell with the Bible when I read it multiple times. I dwell with any text. I dwell with an algebra problem when I ponder it for a while because I keep making stupid mistakes and forgetting to do things, right? In this contemplation, it's associated with truth, goodness, and beauty. I'm going to go back to an earlier quote. The result of education, he says, is a full-grown physical, intellectual, and moral manhood or womanhood with such resources as are necessary to make life useful and happy, and as will enable the individual to go on learning from all activities of life. So useful goes in which kingdom? Happiness goes in the sense of being in harmony with God, being imitators of Christ. And in all activities in life, that's a lifelong learning. Again, Augustine writes, to possess any subject of study is to know it, and however good a thing is, if it is not loved, it cannot be perfectly possessed. So we have to love knowledge for its own sake, ultimately. So have we done what I said we were going to do? Did we talk about, go through an in-depth look at each of the 7 laws? Did I kind of draw a picture of how man has a common nature and sort of like natural laws that allow the things that Littlejohn and Evans talk about in Wisdom and Eloquence, the analysis and the synthesis and the capacity to adapt to any situation, any learning process? And have we seen how, with the aim towards the true, good, and beautiful, as well as vocational mastery, we prepare our Lutheran students for the 2 kingdoms, to love God with all the heart, mind, strength, and spirit, which is the heavenly love of truth, and knowledge for its own sake, while loving neighbor, which is our vocation. Will we do that? What? Good, because I'm done, and if we have any questions and I didn't do it, you can ask me now. Any questions about any of this? I'll try them. Yeah? Sure. If you go, I have a website, classicalconsultants.org, and there's an events section that you can sign up for. It's August 8th, I think it's 7:30. We're going to do a series of them. There's a handout there. The second one is how to find Christ in all things and all subjects. So if you're studying chemistry, where do you find the Logos? Where do you find Christ? We might record it. Live is good because people get to interact. Yes, we might offer it again. Any other questions about any of this? PM, 7:30 PM, Eastern. Right. Any other questions about it? Yeah.
You talked about a book called How to Solve It from 1945. Who's the author?
Polya, P-O-L-Y-A. He's a mathematician, and he's trying to help students who are struggling to learn how to solve problems.
P-O-Y-L-A?
P-O-L-Y-A, Polya. Okay. Anything else? Sometimes one of the criticisms is that this earlier process is a lot like a Paul Parrot stage, or you're just, and we get that a lot in the Lutheran church as well. You know, if I teach my child to say the Lord's Prayer, is he really understanding what he's doing? If I teach the Nicene Creed and recite it, do they really understand it? But realize that that process, that parroting back or memorizing and reciting back, is the first step. you have to go down here. You have to take it from that first step down to the full understanding. And it's a lot of fun. And it's a lot of fun to teach kids who are doing just the experience. Anybody else? I know it's a lot. Go read the book.